Samuel Johnson, which is always an excellent way to begin a sentence, remarks that though human beings have been wise in different ways, they've always laughed in the same way, but that's surely doubtful, isn't it? I mean, laughter is a language with a host of different idioms. Cackling, chortling, grunting, chuckling, shrieking, bellowing, screaming, sniggering. I intend to go on like this to the end of the session, by the way. This is just gasping, shouting, braying, yelping, roaring, tittering, hooting, guffawing, snorting, howling, screeching, bellowing, snickering, and so on. What have I missed out? There's a prize for anybody who spots it. That's so you can buy 2 copies of my book when you get crying with laughter. Yes, there's something in the book about the relation between laughter and tears, yes. Giggling, I missed out giggling. Nah, nobody's going to buy 2 copies of my book. And the paradox of laughter is that in one sense it's purely a question of the signifier. It's mere sound. Yes? It's an enunciation which is literally without meaning. It expresses nothing but itself. It lacks intrinsic sense, rather like an animal's cry. But at the same time, of course, it's very socially coded. It's richly freighted with cultural meaning, and as such, perhaps it has a kinship with dance or with music. I mean, not only has laughter no inherent meaning, but at its most riotous and convulsive, it involves a disintegration of meaning as the body tears one's speech to fragments and the id pitches the ego into temporary disarray. As with grief or extreme fear or blind rage, truly uproarious laughter involves a loss of physical control as the body gets momentarily out of hand and we regress to the uncoordinated state of the infant. Laughter is quite literally a bodily disorder. Some kinds of laughter. There's also something alarmingly animal about the activity, not least about the kind of noise it involves, hooting, braying, here I go again, cackling, neighing, bellowing. It calls to mind our affinity with the other animals, which is ironic because, of course, they don't laugh themselves, or not conspicuously so, though Darwin thought that monkeys chuckled when they're tickled. I don't know if anybody's tickled a monkey recently and can bear evidence about that. So in this sense, laughter is at once animal and distinctively human. A miming of the noise of the beasts, but quite unbeast-like in itself. And in one sense, you might say laughter represents the momentary collapse of the so-called symbolic order or disruption of it, of the sphere of orderly and articulate meaning, while in another sense, it never ceases to rely on that sphere because we always laugh for a reason. It's true that laughter can become contagious, so that we laugh because somebody's laughing or because we've just laughed, and it, as it were, passes from one person to the other, and we forget in the end what we're laughing at. But normally, laughter has a reason. It's a form of utterance which springs straight from the libidinal depths of the body, but there's a cognitive dimension to it as well, as there is indeed to all emotions. I'm afraid of a beast because I know it's hungry. I know it has the habit of eating human beings. I know it has a particular hankering for the flesh of people like myself from the northwest of England, and so on. You can break an emotion down into its cognitive elements. Okay, laughter is not, speaking of contagiousness, laughter isn't always a laughing matter. There have even been apparently lethal epidemics of the stuff in China, Africa, Siberia and elsewhere, mass hysterical paroxysms in which, so it's alleged, thousands of people have actually died of laughter. So they say. In 1962, one such outbreak in what was then Tanganyika immobilized thousands of whole school districts for months on end. And since being out of control is never entirely gratifying, laughter can easily border on the unpleasant. Johnson, again, defines it in his dictionary as convulsive merriment, which is almost, isn't it, an oxymoron, like, say, business ethics. Samuel Beckett once remarked that he had a strong weakness for an oxymoron. The same, of course, is true of being tickled, isn't it? You know, with its curious blend of the pleasurable and the unbearable. Lying through his teeth, the narrator of Lawrence Sterne's great novel Tristram Shandy tells us that he once laughed so hard he broke a blood vessel and lost 4 pints of blood in 2 hours. The novelist Anthony Trollope suffered a stroke while laughing at a comic novel, a misfortune by which few of his own readers are likely to be afflicted. You can, in short, treat laughter as a kind of text or as a language with so many regional accents or dialects. Upper-class Englishmen, for example, are more likely to bray. Everybody I was at Cambridge with, this was in the early years of the Industrial Revolution, a long time ago, and they were all men, of course, all brayed all the time, you know. Whereas middle-class English women are more likely to tinkle than to bray. Military generals tend not to giggle or popes to cackle. Those who play Santa Claus may beam, but they will be ill-advised to snigger. It's hard to imagine Arnold Schwarzenegger simpering, though easy enough to imagine him leering. The president of the World Bank is permitted to laugh heartily, but not hysterically. They might get a bit worried, you know, if he starts rolling on the floor and totally out of control. Quite a lot of humour involves what Freud calls de-sublimation. The psychical energies that we invest in some noble ideal, some moral ideal, are released as laughter when the ideal is punctured in some way. There's a kind of economics, a psychical economics of laughter in Freud. You know, we invest certain amounts of psychical energy in certain things. When they go awry or when they're deflated, then that energy for Freud is expended in the form of laughter. Yeah. Sustaining ideals involves a degree of psychological strain, and so not having to do so can be a pleasurable sensation. We're now free from having to maintain a reputable moral front and can reap the delectable fruits of being shamelessly crude, cynical, selfish, lecherous, insulting, morally indolent, emotionally anaesthetised and outrageously self-indulgent. But it's not only a matter of moral ideals, because for Freud we also invest quite a lot of unconscious energy, cathexis as he calls it, simply in the exigencies of sense-making itself, of ordinary, everyday making sense, what Freud calls the compulsion of logic, a process which involves unwelcome constraints, necessary constraints to be sure, but unwelcome ones on the anarchic unconscious, which really wants to be free of them. Hence our delight in the surreal and absurd, in a world in which anything is possible, as in one of the BBC radio goon shows, when somebody had the crafty device during the Second World War of floating a life-size cardboard replica of the British Isles off the British Isles in order to fool German bombers. For psychoanalytic thought, remaining serious involves a certain successful repression. And so joking is, as it were, a brief vacation from the mild oppressiveness of everyday meaning. Jokes buck the tyranny of what Freud calls the reality principle, afford us a certain infantile satisfaction as we regress to a condition which predates the jealously enforced divisions and precisions of the symbolic order, and we're able to throw logic and linearity and continuity and so on to the winds. humour does for adults then what play does for children, namely liberate them momentarily from the despotism of the reality principle and allow the pleasure principle some careful but scrupulously regulated play. In that sense, it's rather like art, yes, which allows the pleasure principle play, but in a carefully regulated sort of way. Quite a lot of humour also springs from things being out of keeping, being estranged or defamiliarised, deprived for a moment of their allotted place in the overall scheme of things. We laugh when some phenomenon suddenly gets out of place or things go off the rails, get out of kilter, and that kind of comedy represents a momentary respite from the tyrannical legibility of the world, a kind of lost innocence which predates our calamitous fall into meaning. The fall, of course, theologically speaking, is a fall up, not a fall down. Not down to the beasts, the other beasts, they're okay, up into consciousness, language, history, technology, and so on. So it's not perhaps surprising that the demonic is so often associated with humour, that hell traditionally resounds with the obscene cackling, sniggering and guffawing of those lost souls who believe they've seen through human value and exposed it as the pompous charade that it is. Thomas Mann speaks of this laughter in Dr. Faustus, no doubt the greatest of all novels about damnation, apart maybe from William Golding's Pincher Martin, except that I used to think Martin was in hell, but now I realise he's in purgatory. What a silly mistake to make, yes. But in Dr. Faustus, Mann speaks of this demonic or diabolical laughter as, I quote, a hellish merriment of yelling, screeching, bawling, here I go again, bleating, howling, piping, the mocking, exultant laughter of the pit. The demonic versus the angelic. The demonic is, as it were, too little meaning, thinking that meaning is superfluous and pretentious and pompous, yes. The angelic, Milan Kundera thinks in this way in the Book of Laughter and Forgetting, the angelic is, as it were, too much meaning, when life is solemnly stuffed with meaning, you know, earnest and high-minded and as it were, morally superior. But the demonic against the angelic is Iago against Othello, or Milton's smoulderingly rebellious Satan against his constipated bureaucrat of a deity. Laughter is satanic, writes Charles Baudelaire, is therefore profoundly human. The devils can't suppress a spasm of incredulous laughter at the sheer gullibility of men and women, their pathetic eagerness to believe that their gratuitous, arbitrary, unfounded, paper-thin meanings and values are as solid as flat irons. And they're out to, they find that intolerable, as Iago finds the mere presence of Othello intolerable, and they are simply itching to debunk it and deflate it. A lot of debunkery in Irish literature. One of the maybe the major trope in Irish literature is debunking, cutting savagely down to size like Jonathan Swift. There is an extremely implausible theory of humour on which I spend a chapter in this utterly magnificent book of mine, which is the so-called superiority theory. That's to say, we laugh because we feel superior in some way to foolish or people. It's famous, one of the originators of this is Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan. Humour essentially is aggressive. Yes, basically is aggressive. I mean, there are obviously jokes which mock women, for example, as in this vignette of God, a woman, creating the universe, and there was darkness on the face of the earth, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, and God said, "Could I just see the darkness again?" To which a suitable feminist riposte might be, what do you call the useless bit at the end of the penis? The man. Yeah. The Irish have been known to savour, well, quite a lot of the time, the Irish savour anti-Irish jokes. What's a Kerry man's foreplay? Brace yourself, Bridget. While Jews are not slow to recount anecdotes against themselves, Goldberg is walking along a riverbank with his adult son when the son slips and falls into the water. "Help!" shouts Goldberg. "My son, the lawyer, is drowning." Or think of the gag about the benefits of dementia, the fact that you get to bury your own Easter eggs. There's also a very fine cartoon of a bunch of old age pensioners on a protest march raising the cry of, "What do we want? What do we want?" All right. However, by far the most convincing theory of humour, I think, humour is an enormous academic industry in the States, for example. You know, you can get a professorship on the basis of humour. By far the most popular theory is the incongruity theory, but there are all kinds of holes in it. For example, not all humour is based on incongruity, and the word incongruity is so elastic that it can cover too many things. However, on this view, humour springs from a clash of incongruous aspects, a sudden shift of perspective, a kind of unexpected slippage of meaning, an arresting dissonance or discrepancy, a momentary defamiliarizing of the familiar, and so on. We're informed by psychologists that the peekaboo game, where one appearance is followed rapidly by one incongruous with it, is children find it funny even when only a few months old. In fact, I was playing this with one of my children the other day and he was absolutely rolling on the floor. He's 22, in fact. But, so a slippage from one framework to another. You've got to stop masturbating, said a doctor to a patient. Why, said the patient? Because I'm trying to conduct a medical examination. Slippage from, as it were, masturbating in general to this particular situation. Or take the anecdote of the British Army officer in the Second World War who asked a Gurkha sergeant to instruct his men to leap from an aircraft at 1,000 feet. The sergeant consulted his men and returned to the officer with the verdict that they regarded the jump as too dangerous. They were prepared to jump from 500 feet, but not from 1,000. Dismayed by this apparent failure of nerve in such a plucky breed as the Gurkha, the officer pointed out that at 500 feet the men's parachutes wouldn't have time to open. "Oh, we have parachutes," said the Gurkha. There's a similar slippage of meaning in the story of a visitor being shown around a Moscow art gallery and pausing by a guide and pausing before a painting entitled Lenin in St. Petersburg. Looking at the canvas more closely, all the visitor can see is a portrayal of Lenin's wife, Krupskaya, in bed with a handsome young man in a Moscow hotel room. But where is Lenin? Asked the visitor, to which, of course, the guide replies, "Lenin is in St. Petersburg." So a quick slide of meaning, a shift of viewpoint, or a sudden bulking of expectations can occur at a purely verbal level. The next joke nobody ever laughs at. I don't know why. Maybe they don't get it. "Would you like a bridal suite?" A young man asks his bride-to-be, planning their honeymoon, to which she replies, "No thanks, I'll just hang on to your ears." Would you like a bridal suite? Or think of Dorothy Parker's retort to being told that revellers at Halloween duck for apples. "There, but for a single consonant, is the story of my life." So two divergent meanings collide in a kind of economy of difference and identity, as in the famous "Have you read Marx? Only where I sit down." Thank you very much. And that disruption of expectations, setting up a situation only to pull the rug out from somebody verbally, purely verbally here, A familiar form of incongruity, familiar, for example, in the wit of Oscar Wilde. Nothing succeeds like excess, famous example, or his complaint that I live in constant fear of not being misunderstood. The young people today have no respect for dyed hair, is one of Wilde's mock complaints. A Freudian slip, of course, is where you say one thing and mean another. The friend of Wilde's, the rather shady fin de siècle poet, Ernest Dowson, who used to frequent a lot of brothels and low dives, once said that absinthe makes the tart grow fonder. The famously alcoholic Brendan Behan described himself as a drinker with a writing problem. In all of these cases, the sense of a word or phrase is comically askew to the one that we're geared up to expect. Language is in and out of place at the same time, as we're forced to hold a conventional meaning in tension with a semantic twist. Or another of Dorothy Parker's cracks, the sea crossing was so rough that the only thing I could keep on my stomach was the first mate. Or think of the sign you sometimes used to find, you don't find it anymore, I think, on garbage cans, refuse to be put in this basket. Where everything hinges on which syllable of refuse you stress, being solemnly admonished not to allow oneself to be stuffed into the basket. On the subject of individual words and just how often jokes can turn on a slip of the signifier, the famous story, you may know it again, but please laugh even so, of the man who's goes in hospital and asked to be castrated, and the doctors try and argue him out of this perverse demand, but he's insistent, and so in the end, reluctantly, they remove his testicles in a long operation, wheel him back onto the ward, where there's another patient who's just been operated on, and the man says, "What were you in for?" He says, "Circumcision." And the man says, "That's the word." Just to summarise a little, humour, I'm arguing, happens for the most part when some fleeting disruption of a well-ordered world of meaning loosens the grip of the reality principle. It's as if for a moment the ego is able to relinquish its grim-lipped insistence on congruence, coherence, logic, linearity, univocal signifiers and so on, ceases also to fend off unwanted meanings that we do all the time, yes, unconscious associations, allows us, like art, to revel in a playful diversity of sense so that we economize on the psychical energy we need usually to repress all that and release it in a burst of laughter. Kind of economics of humour, if you like. The book has rather more in it than just about that. A minor change of punctuation even can be a small rupture of logic through which laughter wells up, as in the famous cricket commentary on radio when the commentator said, the batsman's holding, the bowler's willy. If you take out the comma between those two phrases, it has a different kind of meaning. I just want to end by, there's a kind of long section in the book on wit and what is wit and why is it associated so often with the aristocracy and a certain style of languid and leisurely life and so on. But all I'll just say at the moment is that wit is often compared to the thrust of a rapier. It's rapier-like in its swift, shapely, streamlined, agile, flashing, glancing, dazzling, dexterous, pointed, clashing, flamboyant aspects, but also because it can stab and wound. And I quote that sentence simply because I spent 2 weeks writing it. I, at one point put in a semicolon and I stared at it for a couple of days, as Gustave Flaubert is reported to have done, James Joyce as well. and then sort of took it out again, and so on. Anyway, I think I will leave things there, and if anybody wants to brutally demolish that whole case, then you are free to do so. Is there a mic? Oh, there is.
Any questions or contributions? Come in.
Thank you very much. One kind of thing that many people often find funny, although I don't think it was mentioned, and I don't know where it would fit into theories of humour, is imitations or impressions. Somebody sounding like somebody else, or something looking like somebody else, as somebody like Steve Coogan nowadays might do, or lots of people have done in the past. So where do you think that particular kind of comedy fits into your schema?
Well, partly because in a lot of humour or comedy, what we're laughing or what we're admiring, what relaxes us, is the sheer artistry of it, isn't it? Which is in a sense independent of certain other factors, but it's quite important. So we admire the way that somebody imitates somebody else. But also there's the theory, the aggression theory of humour might suggest that we also imitate other people to show that we can be them even more than they can. We can outdo them in being themselves. But thirdly, there's something, either humorous or maybe uncanny about doubling, isn't there? We expect things to be separate and singular, and when they're doubling, when they're doubled up, then we have maybe a sort of mixture of a rather primitive fear of that in one sense, and yet it's also kind of funny. If somebody comes on stage dressed in a certain way and then somebody instantly comes, there's something funny about it. On a Freudian theory, that may be that we save a certain amount of energy on putting two objects into one. Yeah. But that's an interesting point. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about the absurd, or perhaps the foolish is a better way of putting it. Because in one sense, the foolish makes us laugh. It's funny, but if you think back to the Christian tradition and through the early Desert Fathers, you have fools who are doing things that might seem funny, but are actually, in a sense, being morally superior and rather austere by doing this absurd thing. And whether that sort of, how you think that fits into your scheme between the angelic and the diabolic.
Yes, that's a very interesting question. Olivia in Twelfth Night says there's no harm in an allowed fool, says to, is it Feste? Meaning, if the fool, one of the paradoxes of the fool himself is that he questions everybody else's social roles, but that's his social role. He has an allotted, permitted part in society. When that starts getting out of hand, then that's sort of different. The tradition of wisdom as folly and folly as wisdom isn't, of course, confined to Christianity, but it's a very strong, as you I'm sure you know, it's a very strong Christianity. St. Paul, has come to deflate, as it were, the wisdom of the Greeks. Yes, the folly of the cross. Part of the meaning, I suppose, of Jesus' descent into hell after the crucifixion, which is not scriptural but is traditional, is, of course, it's a descent into utter absurdity and meaninglessness. It's demonic in that precise sense. It's not just that these are bad meanings or values, it's that there's no value at all. Everything becomes, in hell, everything becomes excrementally the same as everything else. Yeah? And one should think about that before one's too quick to object to the idea of hierarchies, which is a very common postmodern gesture. Everybody is a hierarchicalist in the sense that they think that some values are more important than others. There wouldn't be a human being who doesn't believe that. But the demonic or diabolical vision is an excremental one. There's absolutely no distinction between these things, and that's what causes the what I suppose Lacan would call jouissance, obscene enjoyment, the obscene revelling in the lack of meaning, which you could see, of course, aspects of in the Nazis, you know, just sort of, you know, Arbeit macht frei. It's a kind of sick joke, you know, you're just taunting people unnecessarily. Yeah. One of the qualities of evil, of course, as opposed to just being very, very, very bad, is that it seems to be done entirely for its own sake. It's not a utilitarian phenomenon. There doesn't seem to be any need or use for it. I'm moving away from your point about foolishness, but the other way of putting that perhaps is that for Freud, there's always non-meaning at the root of meaning. Yes, that's not to say that there isn't, that meaning is just flimsy or not important at all. I mean, one side of Freud is a rationalist, yeah? But beneath that, there's a kind of non-meaning, because if you have a set of rules for being rational, combining things, being coherent and so on, it's actually built into such rules that they can always go wrong. They can always be used in a different way to create, say, absurdities. Yeah. So absurdity is built into sense-making in that sense. Yeah. There was somebody here.
Thank you. That was very funny. I recently started doing improv comedy, and my teacher last week said we should invest in our characters and our emotional honesty because we would get better, more meaningful laughs. And I wondered if you agreed that certain laughs are kind of qualitatively better than others, and if so, what types of disruption to seriousness led to different types of laughs?
Yes, the laughs I get are qualitatively superior. Yes, that's true. Except, you see, there's also a very interesting theories of humour which really have very little to do with investing in one's character or being oneself or indeed empathy. You know, the interesting thing is that in postmodern culture, empathy is somehow seen as always a positive value. I mean, sadists need a lot of empathy. You know, they need to be able to feel the pain that they're inflicting on people. Empathy in itself, I think, is not a value. Being together with an audience isn't necessarily a value. And of course, in a way, the great theorist of that is Bertolt Brecht, you know, where the point is, in a certain sense, to distantiate the audience, or the actor doing that by distantiating him or herself, you know, famous Alienation Effect. So that what Brecht is after is a kind of reflective laughter, as against the common bourgeois notion, you know, that seriousness is one thing and folly or humour is another. At the end of this book, I look at my old pal Trevor Griffiths' famous play Comedians, yes, and those sorts of questions are raised there. I think, yeah.
Thank you. I've always thought that the thing that makes Donald Trump seem the least like any other person that I know anything about is the fact that I can't imagine him laughing at anything. And I wondered whether you agreed with that and what that might say about a person.
Yes. It may be the case that, and this is a wild and reckless generalization, but why not? The night is young. It may be the case that Americans laugh less at themselves than the English do. Yeah. That self-debunkery is a common, I mean, a famous trait of the British. Of course, self-debunkery can suggest a secret kind of confidence. You know, look how assured I am. I can even put myself down. Yeah. But self-irony is not a great American trait, is it? So that there are other reasons why Trump doesn't laugh, but it always seems to me that one of the strongest arguments against Christianity or against any kind of theism, is that if God exists, he must be hopelessly besotted with Donald Trump. That is just so implausible that that in itself would be a reason, for not being. I'm not saying, there aren't good reasons for being a theist. I think there are, but the idea. Obviously, by definition, God must be utterly, hopelessly in love with Donald Trump, the only person on the planet who is. I was very struck by during the recent London demo against Trump. Did you see? There's a wonderful placard that just read "Free Melania."
As one of the oldest people here, I confidently expect to be contradicted by younger people, especially the improv artist at the front. But it seems to me that young people nowadays don't really tell jokes. Is that wrong? I mean, my kids don't tell jokes, and if they do, they're told off for telling dad jokes. It's possibly because they tell my jokes. But are young people not telling jokes as much as old people do?
Is it Paul, by the way?
Sorry?
Is it? What's your name?
Peter.
Oh, sorry. Jokes, yes, telling jokes. Yes. There's again a difference between American and British culture, isn't there, in terms of the gag. You see, a gag is really very self-evident, it's a piece of humour. Whereas, and you can punctuate the seriousness of everyday life with various bits of humour which are obviously humour, which have, as it were, quotation marks around them, yes. And then you get on with the fairly serious business of, making money or whatever it happens to be. Whereas there is an English humour which is much more of a way of seeing the world, a certain kind of amused, ironic, partly detached, partly witty stance towards the world, whose origins are really, again, aristocratic. It's a result of the peculiar cultural dominance of the aristocracy, traditionally, in British society, that nothing is really that serious or important. I mean, Oscar Wilde, of course, wasn't English, but did a much better imitation of the English than they did themselves, embodies precisely that kind of aesthetic stance towards reality, finding things amusing in a rather languid and detached way. That's very different from the gag, because it's a way of life, yes. And the gag is a holiday from everyday meaning to which you then return. But as for children, I don't know. They don't tell jokes anymore. Huh. Do your children tell jokes? No. No. Although perhaps some of them are too young and some of them are too old. Some of them are too world-weary to tell jokes, and some of them haven't. Essentially, you can't, as far as humour as estrangement goes, or deviation, incongruity, you can't get very small children to laugh at that, can you? Because you can't, as it were, appreciate a deviation unless you have a sure grasp of the norm. Yes, and if everything is still wondrously unfamiliar and keeps changing every moment, then you won't laugh at that. Also, one psychoanalytic thinker said, I think as far as, as far as the repression, humour as the momentary release of disreputable instincts or thoughts. He argues that a purely virtuous person wouldn't be humorous or wouldn't laugh because they wouldn't have those thoughts in the first place, and a totally vicious person wouldn't have them either for the opposite reason, namely they would have no superego to repress them. They wouldn't respect, as it were, the necessary repression of the superego. The superego, of course, is, as well as being for Freud sort of mad, utterly out of control, placing ridiculously excessive demands on us that it ought to know we can't live up to, punishing us sadistically and viciously almost for its own sake. As well as all that, for Freud, the superego is absolutely necessary. There would be no social life, without it. Just as these days the word authority is so often demonized in postmodern culture, as though all forms of authority were somehow negative or malign. Of course not. There is the authority of lived experience, the authority, say, of those who lived through the fight against apartheid. Yeah? And authority in itself is by no means to be dismissed any more than, again, a postmodern custom, the idea that power is to be dismissed. There's absolutely nothing wrong with power, and I can't get enough of it myself. Yeah? All depends on who has it, for what reasons. People who disown power usually have enough of it to do so. Yeah. Yes. Oh, okay.
Do you have any thoughts about why some types of comedy or humour age better than others? So I'm thinking, for example, P.G. Wodehouse is still funny decades later. I see, yeah.
I've tried again to read Wodehouse, and I can't. I have a blind spot about him somehow. I mean, I love Evelyn Waugh's early comedy, but Wodehouse I can't. I just found perhaps a kind of excessive whimsy in him. Whimsy, of course, is again a very English mode of humour. It's like the same question with art, is it? I mean, it's no question of aesthetics. Why do certain artworks endure and certain others don't? Well, you might just say because some are better than others, yes. But the more interesting answer is that some works are such that different generations and different audiences can find different things in them, yes. That a classic is less a kind of immobilized work on a pedestal than something which continually releases new meanings under different conditions. Works sometimes cease to be readable for a while, and then under new historical conditions become readable once more. One of the greatest of all English novels, which nobody except myself has ever read because it's incredibly long, as to say Richardson's Clarissa in the 18th century, just ceased to be readable over the 19th century, not because it was too long, but because, people just ridicule it. And what brought it back into readability? The women's movement. Once the women's movement, began to gather steam, then you could look at the novel, a novel about a violated woman, in a quite different way. So I think that it's not simply a matter of works either being ephemeral, although there's nothing wrong with ephemeral art, is there? Some art is meant to be ephemeral. Or art which endures forever. How do we know it will endure forever? But there's also that different case of works which swim in and out of classical status quite often. So somebody else wanted to ask. Oh, yeah.
Yes, I wondered how you accounted for the popping up of comedians in national politics. I mean, not just the European candidates, but in Georgia and in the populist right in Italy.
Yeah.
You see comedians as politicians rather than the other way around.
Perhaps. Yes. The word comedian, of course, it can loosely mean a kind of idiot, can't it? He's a real comedian. It doesn't mean necessarily somebody who's deliberately funny. It means almost the reverse. He's not deliberately funny, but he just is funny. Remember when Ken Dodd was on trial for tax evasion? No, nobody in the room will remember this. It's like asking if you remember Napoleon. Only I will remember it. And he was, his defence counsel, in a very wily way, pointed out that while some accountants were comedians, not many comedians were accountants. So there's that. So as it were, if you have a bunch of politicians who are comedians in the wide sense of the word, why not literalize that and have an actual comedian, as it were, playing the part, in order, like the traditional fool, among other things, to show something of the arbitrariness of power. Yeah? Power will only survive. Actually, even David Hume argues this. Conservative, Tory David Hume in the 18th century argues that basically power is in the hands of the people, not that he was any kind of democrat, but that literally power will only survive as long as we give some kind of consent to it, however passive, however qualified. The moment that power ceases to have that consent, then it's the writing is on the wall for it. Yeah. And perhaps it's part of the tradition of the fool or comic that the unfoundedness of power, the fact that power resides in a certain consensus about it, which could always be different. The fool shows that up in a sense. Yes, I think yeah, right. Yeah.
I've got a friend who spends hours and hours each day coming up with puns, and the puns are they're pretty good. But I wondered whether you think trying to be funny or striving to be funny is a worthwhile use of one's time.
Is a what, sorry?
A worthwhile use of one's time.
Yeah. I say in the book, I think that puns are the lowest form of comic life. Aren't they? What puns tend to elicit is not laughter, but groans. People groan. Why do they groan? That's interesting. Perhaps because they're too obvious, because they're too artificial, they're too synthetic. I mean, it's part of humour, to sometimes not to be too aware of it. Self-consciousness in humour can be fatal, and puns are very self-conscious. And interesting fact for anybody who's a fan of James Joyce, that the Joyce scholars tell us, I don't know, there isn't a single pun in Finnegan's Wake. I mean, the greatest sport with language, the greatest anti-novel of all time, perhaps, where English is just, well, what language is it written in is a good question to ask. English, but of a kind, of course, written by an Irishman, by somebody outside the English consensus. But evidently, no, for some reason, Joyce avoids all puns. Maybe for that reason, that they're too obvious. Oh, sorry, yeah.
I'm just thinking about a variety of questions that you've had. For example, contrasting age with youth, men and women, and I'm just thinking about that thing that often happens when I try to tell a joke and they just don't get it. And I'm thinking back to that idea again about superiority and cultural context and all of those negotiations that you play out in your own mind in the process of telling a joke in relation to your audience and the context that you're in.
Yes. You think it's because they don't get us and not because it's not funny? It's right. Yes.
It can go wrong.
Yeah. You've got a very good point. Humour is very context-bound, isn't it? I mean, notoriously, different cultures find different things funny. Yeah, that's why Johnson's wrong to think that we always laugh in the same way. We don't. And one difference there is historical and cultural. There are some rather strange theorists of laughter or comedy who think that, it's kind of like the Whig theory of history, who think that we'll be getting funnier and funnier. in the sense, well, that's true in this sense, isn't it? That, say, Victorian Punch cartoons are not funny to us. Humour, like anything else, depends on a certain collective sensibility. Yeah. Even when you're just telling a joke to a small circle of people. So, and sensibility shifts and changes. Yeah. And poets, for example, are going to be caught out, or artists in general, unless they're somehow attuned to a particular sensibility. I think the same is very true of comedy, of culture. Comedy, of course, doesn't have to be funny. I think, as I say in the book, nobody's sort of carried out of an audience at Midsummer Night's Dream, clutching a broken blood vessel. Shakespeare isn't very funny. I don't know if he was trying to be, but if he was, he didn't succeed. Comedy there is much more, well, there's a strange, the deepest use of the word comedy, which again I look at in the book, is, think of the title, The Divine Comedy. there aren't many laughs in the Divine Comedy, not least in the Inferno. But comedy there, of course, has a relation to the word cosmic. It means a kind of cosmic order. And subjectively, it means something like that very deep feeling that despite everything, and contrary to all appearances, all is fundamentally well. That is perhaps the deepest comic feeling that one can have. And there's nothing funny about it, though it might lead to humour. It might release wit or humour. It is, of course, in part a Christian notion. The fact that fundamentally, contrary to all appearances, amazingly, despite all the awfulness and ugliness and brutality of the human, things are fundamentally well, is a Christian doctrine, except, of course, that Christianity goes on to add that the price of living that is fearfully steep. It's nothing less than death and self-dispossession. And you don't necessarily know if that's going to work out. Whereas in stage comedy, of course, part of the way we can psychically relax is we do know that it's going to work out. There may at the end of it be some wayward element like, say, Malvolio, who says, I'll be revenged on the pack of you, something that refuses to be incorporated, just to show that this is an artifact, just to show that this isn't, just to show that probably in real life this wouldn't have worked out this way at all. Yeah? I mean, there's this rather chilling thought that at times it might seem that only in art, only in the comic novel or comic drama, is this kind of reconciliation actually possible. And there may be some way in which the work ironically gestures to this. Part of its authenticity is the fact that it tries to show that. Yeah? That, in real life, Tom Jones would have been hanged, or something awful would have happened to, Caliban would have eaten Prospero or something. Remember when Prospero says at the end, his final speech, release me from my bands with the help of your good hands, to the audience. What he means is, applaud. Why? Because if you applaud, you'll show that you know you're in a theatre. You'll show that you realise this is a fiction. Don't take it just simply as fact, but then you can leave the theatre, bringing with you whatever value you've reaped from this particular drama. But if you confuse it with life, you will, as it were, be immobilised in the theatre forever, and Prospero won't be able to leave his island, and so on. I've no idea what question started that off. Yeah.
You wrote a very funny review in the London Review of Books a little while ago about the Earl of Portsmouth.
About?
The Earl of Portsmouth.
Oh, yes.
And it was very funny because he was so bizarre. He was mad, basically, and got up to all kinds of scrapes.
Yes.
I just want to tap into your class analysis and ask, would his behaviour be funny if he weren't an aristocrat?
Yes.
If he were just a normal,
yes,
poor working man of the time, peasant?
Yeah. It's a good question. His behaviour, this was a notoriously mad aristocrat, but aristocracy and madness in English culture are associated, aren't they? Not only because of the inbreeding, but because the difference between the aristocrat and the bourgeois is the bourgeois conforms obediently to rules and norms. The aristocrat doesn't give a damn. So there's something anarchic about the aristocrat, which ironically links him to, the buffoon or the fool or the thief, or, there's a kind of traditional alliance, liaison between the very top and the very low. Some people fall below the reach of power and other people are perched above it. And that means that the aristocrat is able to be purely himself. He is a law unto himself. He doesn't acknowledge what you might call a heteronymous law, power outside himself. I tell in the book the story of, I talk about this story of Brian Howard, the original for Anthony Blanche in Brideshead Revisited, or one of the originals, who was in some kind of low dive when it was raided by the police, and an inspector came up to him and said, your name and address, sir? And he said, my name is Brian Howard. I live in Berkeley Square, and you, Inspector, I suppose, come from some dreary little suburb. I mean, that kind of insolence, yes, is typically English aristocratic. Those who make the rules are able to break them, yes, and get off with impunity. So there is something, to revert to your point about the Earl of Portsmouth, there's a thin line between amiable idiosyncrasy and alarming eccentricity, isn't there? And the aristocrat often kicks over the trail. I think of Byron, for example, mad, bad and dangerous to know. That a certain kind, if madness is in a certain sense a deviation from the consensus on which everybody agrees, then there's a way in which almost by definition the aristocrat is mad, because he's outside that consensus. He doesn't feel its constraint. There's no reason for him to do so. Yeah.
Shall we call it and say thank you very much to Terry Eagleton? Thank you so much.